Hello and welcome to today's lecture on sex and gender. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some guiding principles for today's talk. First, we must always remember that everyone has a culture, or multiple cultures. Also, every culture has norms, values, and beliefs about gender, sex, and sexuality. All cultures are dynamic, which means cultures can and do change over time. Cultures and their attitudes and their beliefs do change. Another question we need to review is, what is ethnocentrism? Be sure to understand this. And how can we avoid being ethnocentric? This is very important, especially moving forward with the rest of today's lecture. Let's start with some key terms and definitions. The first term is sex. Now, I don't mean the verb sex or to have sex. I'm going to give you a definition that I will be using throughout the rest of today's lecture. For purposes of this course, the definition of sex is the biological basis of humanity that is determined by genitals, hormones, internal reproductive organs, and also chromosomes and chromosomal makeup. Typically, someone's sex, we have male, female, and another category that I will share with you called intersex. Gender is exclusive from the term sex for purposes of this lecture. Gender is different than sex, in that gender is the cultural and social norms for behavior and presentation that are associated with someone's sex. So sex are the body parts, your chromosomes, and your hormones. But gender is how one's sex is displayed culturally. Now that might get a little confusing, but I'll give you some examples in just a moment. The last term is sexual orientation. Sexual orientation are the romantic or sexual inclinations or feelings towards a specific gender and or sex. Here in our culture, we typically label people as straight or gay. But in reality, it is really not that black and white. There isn't that binary when it comes to sexual orientation. Anthropologists like to look at sexual orientation similar to gender and similar to sex as more of a spectrum, something that is fluid and not fixed. This first video is called What Does It Mean to Be Intersex? And it's produced by BuzzFeed. Now keep in mind the individuals in this video use the term intersex. They don't use the term hermaphrodite, and neither do anthropologists. It's an important distinction to make. I like to tell my students, frogs and snails are hermaphrodites, not human beings.
Raise your hands if you have testes. I'm Pigeon.
I'm Alice.
I'm Emily.
I'm Cypher.
And we are Intersexy.
Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of male or female.
I have XY chromosomes, but typical female genitalia.
I'm a girl who has testes and XY chromosomes.
I identify as a queer, gender nonconforming intersex person.
I identify as a black intersex man.
Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. I mean, there's probably even intersex dinosaurs, if you think about it.
Transgender has to deal with your gender identity, whereas intersex has to deal with your biological characteristics.
Often, intersex people get surgeries that they don't want, and transgender people have to fight for surgeries that they do want. They gave my mom the excuse that the internal testes were cancerous, that I would develop cancer.
They didn't even come up with an excuse, basically, in terms of a health-related reason. They instead just said it was about the appearance.
A lot of doctors are very uncomfortable with the idea that I have testes, and they're still trying to get them removed, but I'm perfectly healthy and there's nothing wrong with them.
They did a surgery to remove my testes and told my parents to take me home and just raise me as a girl, and I didn't find out about it myself until I was 12.
There aren't a lot of options, or medical providers don't explore other options. My mom would put me in dresses and she would be like, "Oh, aren't you so cute and you're so pretty?" And I would be like, "No, this is horrible." I I was put on hormonal treatment, which consisted of estrogen and progesterone. I just wanted to belong. I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be different. So even though I knew something felt amiss, I conformed. He was very condescending. He was like, "You intersex activists don't know what you're talking about."
It's difficult for intersex people to find each other because from an early age we're told not to talk about our bodies.
I did feel like I was the only one.
My doctors always told me there was nobody else like me, and so it just perpetuates a vicious cycle of shame and stigma that we can't break out of. I would tell another intersex person that you are worthy, you are lovable.
Your body is beautiful. You're beautiful.
Intersex people don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with them.
I know you feel like you might not be able to get through this. I know you might have really dark thoughts, but I want you to know that meeting other intersex people and finding a community or a support group can be one of the most important aspects in your healing process. And we're out there, we're out here, we're here. And I just hope you can find us.
This video is important for a number of reasons. One, because we get to see some intersex activists share their personal stories. And number two, because procedures, especially to very young children, are performed to, quote, normalize their body parts. Someone can be born female but develop testes later in life. Or a baby can be born with ambiguous genitalia. And more often than not, parents are encouraged to transform their children to fit a, quote, more normal body type. This can be damaging to individuals for a number of reasons, as we saw with Sevilla's case. It's important to know, however, that it is estimated about 1 out of every 500 people are born intersex. Now that doesn't mean that people are born with a penis and with a vagina. Again, it can manifest in a number of ways. And some people might not even know that they're intersex. You can be born with XXY chromosomes, and without having a full genetic test, you might not even know it. It's also really important to know that it is completely normal for people to be born intersex, but it is something that has become medicalized over the years, and something that has been problematized, and something that needs to be fixed. Or in some cases, like we saw in the video, a baby may be born with testes, and those testes are removed because doctors tell the parents that they may cause cancer, when in reality that is not the case. Here are a couple more definitions that you need to know. The term cisgender. You may or may not have seen this term before, but this is a person whose felt gender matches up with the gender that they were assigned at birth, which is usually based on biological sex. Most people that you see in your day-to-day life are cisgender. You are born with female genitalia and you identify with the female gender. You are comfortable with the gender that you were assigned at birth. A baby is born with a penis and that baby is raised the gender male, and as that individual grows up, they're comfortable with that gender assignment. However, that's not always the case. In popular culture, we have seen a very courageous person, Bruce Jenner, transition to Caitlyn Jenner. This is something that happened late in her life, but it is a person whose felt gender does not match the gender that they were assigned at birth. Some people who are transgender may or may not choose to transition outwardly or in all spaces. Some people who are transgender choose to have sexual affirmation surgery, in which they may have their genitals altered to match their true gender feelings, and some may not. It's an individual choice, and in some cases, these choices are not allowed by laws, or they're very stigmatized. I'm going to share 3 contemporary theories about gender. The first is the biological theory, and our Western culture is largely modeled after this approach. this is probably the gender theory that you are most comfortable with, and that there exists in the quote-unquote natural human order that there are gender binaries, that there are men on one side or the male on one side, and that the female is the polar opposite, that gender is based on one's sex. If you are born with a penis, you must be raised as a man. If you are born with a vagina, you are to project the gender of a woman, and it is based on biology. A more contemporary theory about gender is that gender is something that is socially constructed, or a post-structuralist approach. This theory states that gender has no basis in biology whatsoever, that people are socialized to fit into gender norms. Gender expression and gender performance is also part of gender construction. A third gender theory comes from Julia Serrano, a trans woman, in her book Whipping Girl. Her theory is called intrinsic inclination, and she believes that gender is a combination of both biological and social factors. So she is combining both of the biological theories and the post-structuralist theories. She believes that some part of gender, one's felt gender, is somehow hardwired into the brain, and that gender categories and expressions of gender are two overlapping bell curves, but have continuous possible outcomes. In our culture, we often see pink is for girls and blue is for boys. Contemporary theories on gender believe that from the moment a baby is born, that one's gender is socialized into that child. We wrap a baby boy in a blue blanket and a baby girl in a pink blanket. And from that moment on, that baby is socialized to fit into a gender norm. However, gender norms and expectations change over time, and they're not cultural universals. Because into the 1950s, pink was actually considered a very masculine color. And then in the 1950s, pink shifted to become more of a feminine color, and blue became more of a masculine color. So these gender trends and these gender socializations change over time. And we can see here 3 cultural references. On the left, we see the band Guns N' Roses. Back in the 80s, it was really popular for very masculine men to take on a very female aesthetic. Oftentimes, these heavy metal artists would have big curled hairsprayed hair and wear lip gloss and eyeliner and skin-tight clothing, and they were considered the epitome of masculinity. The image in the middle are 2 women in the 1920s wearing pants. Now, this was considered radical in the 1920s for women to wear pants, and many thought it was the downfall of civilization. Women up until this point were only allowed to wear skirts. Do you know Hillary Clinton's famous pantsuits? Well, it wasn't until 1993 that women in Congress were allowed to even wear pants, which is why pantsuits have become so popular for female politicians. It was actually against the law to not wear a skirt or dress until 1993 here in the United States. On the far right is a French aristocrat, and we can see if we look closely at his shoes, he's wearing high heels. Now, men typically in our Western culture do not wear high heels, but back in the day, 18th century France, it was all the rage. Women didn't wear high heels, but men did. Gender expressions are not culturally fixed. Do you remember Pony Zhao from the film Babies? Well, I asked the question on the worksheet, what is the gender of Pony Zhao? I asked the gender of all of the babies. Hattie from the United States was a girl, and we could tell she was a girl because of her name and how she dressed. Mari from Japan, we could tell was a little girl by how she dressed. And Bayar in Mongolia was a little boy, well, because we saw him pee and we also saw how he dressed as well. We were able to identify those markers, those gender markers with those babies. However, Pony Zhao is a little girl, and only about 30% of you got that correct. The reason many of you got it wrong is because you didn't see the cultural signifiers that identify Pony Zhao as a little girl. You just saw a little bald baby. And because she didn't have the gender markers that you are familiar with, her name is not a Western name that is masculine or feminine, but she does have gender markers. If you look closely, you can tell she's a little girl by the necklace she's wearing, and also the red ochre that her mother uses. Look at Pony Zhao's little head after her haircut. Do you see how it's nice and red and shiny? That's the same ointment that her mother put on her tummy when she was pregnant in the beginning of the film. The Himba in Namibia, in the tribe, the women are all red. They use this red ochre mixture with palm oil to soften their skin and to cleanse themselves. It's a very powerful gender marker for the Himba. Now, this is not something that we do in our culture, which is why it might have been difficult for many of you to identify Pony Zhao as a little girl. There are many cultural expressions of gender that do not fit into the masculine, feminine, Western binary that we believe to be true. In Thailand, there are the Kuthui, which is similar to our sort of English definition of transgender, but it is often much broader and can include effeminate gay males. In South Asia, they have the Hijra, who are born intersex or, more commonly, assigned a male sex at birth, but then later choose to live as a third sex, surgically removing their male genitals and wearing women's clothing. The Hijra model their aesthetic and their way of being after the Hindu Hijra goddess, who is both male and female, thus constructing a third gender. This slide comes from the website from PBS Independent Lens and their Two Spirits map. On nearly every continent and for all of recorded history, thriving cultures have recognized, revered, and integrated more than two genders. Terms such as transgender and gay are new constructs that assume three things that are incorrect. There were only two sexes, and as many as two sexualities, and only two genders. Yet, and this is very important, hundreds of distinct societies and cultures around the globe have their own long-established traditions of third, fourth, fifth, or even more genders. The subject of The Two Spirits, Fred Martinez, for example, from the Independent Lens, was not a boy who wanted to be a girl, but both a boy and a girl. Most Western societies have no direct correlation for this tradition, which can be confusing, especially for first-year anthropology students trying to understand sex and gender. But it is not difficult for many other communities that don't have these strict conceptions of sex and sexuality. Worldwide, the varieties of gender expression is almost limitless. And on this next slide, you're going to see a map, a virtual map, that you can visit to see other cultures and their gender diversity. I'm going to email you all a link to the Two Spirits map. It's an interactive map, and it's really fantastic. You can click on each one of the little blue markers, and it will share with you historic and contemporary cultures and societies that have more than one gender, again, sometimes third, fourth, or even fifth genders, that don't fit into that binary that we have constructed as a culture. I will also be sending you a TED Talk by Gina Rosero, a Filipina beauty queen who was born a boy in the Philippines and came to the United States. and had gender affirmation surgery and is now living as a female beauty queen. So thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.